15 children vanished on a field trip in 1986. 39 years later, the school bus is found buried. In the spring of 1986, excitement buzzed through the small town of Maplewood. 15 children from Evergreen Elementary School climbed aboard a bright yellow school bus for a field trip to a nearby nature reserve. Parents waved proudly, unaware it would be the last time they saw their children. The bus never reached its destination. Hours turned into days, and panic swept the town. The police launched a massive search, combing forests, rivers, and highways. Yet, no trace of the children, the bus, or the driver was ever found. For years, rumors swirled. Some whispered about a kidnapping ring, others about a cult, and a few believed the bus had been driven into a lake. Families held vigils, clinging to hope that their children might one day return. As time passed, grief turned into silence. Parents aged, siblings grew up, and the case became one of the nation's most chilling unsolved disappearances. Investigators described it as a bus swallowed by the earth. Then, nearly 4 decades later, in 2025, construction workers digging the foundation for a housing project made a shocking discovery. Beneath layers of dirt and roots, they unearthed the rusted remains of a school bus. Its windows shattered, the metal frame twisted, and a faded school logo barely visible. The most haunting detail: inside the bus lay scattered belongings, school bags, sneakers, notebooks, and a single stuffed bear, all eerily preserved. There were no bodies, no driver, no explanation, just silence. The discovery reignited national attention. Former students, now adults in their 40s and 50s, gathered to remember their lost classmates. Families demanded answers. Investigators reopened the case, puzzled by how a large vehicle and 15 children could vanish, only to be found buried so deliberately. Theories resurfaced. Had someone intentionally hidden the bus? Was it a cover-up? Or had the children been taken before the bus was buried? Each clue seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Even today, the mystery grips Maplewood. The bus stands as a chilling reminder. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. The disappearance. In the spring of 1986, the small town of Maplewood woke to a morning filled with excitement. Evergreen Elementary School had organized a long-awaited field trip for 15 students, children between the ages of 9 and 11. It was supposed to be an ordinary day of learning and fun, a chance for the kids to explore nature beyond the walls of their classrooms. Parents packed lunches, tied shoelaces, and reminded their children to behave, never suspecting that this day would become the darkest chapter in the town's history. The children boarded the yellow school bus just after 8 a.m., laughing, shouting, and pressing their faces to the windows to wave at their parents. Their teacher and the driver seemed calm, following the same routine they had for countless other trips. The bus pulled away from the school parking lot, and within minutes, it vanished from sight, carrying with it 15 bright futures. For the parents, that cheerful wave goodbye would be the last image of their children they would ever see. At first, the morning passed normally. Teachers who stayed behind expected updates, and parents went about their daily routines. The bus was due to arrive at the Maplewood Nature Reserve by 9:30 a.m., where park staff waited to welcome the group. But by 10 o'clock, there was still no sign of the children. The first phone calls went out, casual at first, checking in to see if perhaps there had been a delay. The calls were met with confusion. The bus had never arrived. By noon, unease spread like wildfire. Parents began to gather at the school, pacing nervously, asking questions no one could answer. The headmaster tried to reassure them, insisting the bus must have taken a wrong turn, but the fear in his voice betrayed him. When police were contacted, they immediately set up roadblocks, believing the bus must have broken down along the way. But every road was searched and every highway exit monitored. There was no sign of a breakdown, no tire marks, no crash. The bus and the children had disappeared without a trace. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier the dread became. News spread quickly across town, and soon local volunteers joined the search. Farmers scoured fields, hikers combed through wooded areas, and divers were sent into nearby lakes and rivers. Still, there was nothing. No bus, no footprints, no evidence that 15 children and their driver had ever traveled those roads at all. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. For the parents, the waiting was unbearable. Some clutched the last items their children had left behind, a favorite toy, a jacket forgotten in the rush to board the bus. Others stood at the school gates, staring down the empty road, willing the bus to return. The sounds of children's laughter that had filled the morning were replaced by the sobs of mothers and the hollow silence of fathers who could not find words. As night fell, the once cheerful town was draped in fear. Police patrols swept through the area. Helicopters with searchlights scanned from above, but the bus remained invisible, as though it had vanished into another world. Every second that passed deepened the mystery and widened the wound that had been inflicted on the community. By the following morning, national media descended upon Maplewood. Cameras captured the desperation on the parents' faces, the confusion etched into the town's streets. Questions poured in. How could a massive school bus carrying so many children vanish in broad daylight? Why had no one seen it leave the main road? The absence of answers only fueled speculation, and with each passing hour, hope seemed to slip further away. In the days that followed, the disappearance of the 15 children became more than just a local tragedy. It became a haunting legend. Everyone in Maplewood remembered where they were that morning, what they were doing, and how they felt when the news broke. What had started as a joyful school trip was now etched in history as a nightmare without explanation. The disappearance of 1986 was not just an unsolved case. It was the beginning of a mystery that would echo for nearly 40 years. Parents clung to hope. Investigators searched tirelessly, but the truth remained buried. What had happened to the children of Evergreen Elementary that morning? Where had the bus gone? And why, despite endless searching, did the world seem to erase all evidence of their journey? The immediate panic. The first signs of panic began subtly, almost quietly, as unanswered questions lingered in the air. Teachers kept glancing at the school clock, whispering among themselves while trying to maintain calm for the remaining students. Parents, who were used to getting a quick confirmation from the field trip destination, started calling one another to ask if anyone had heard from their children. No one had. The school bus, which should have arrived long before, was simply absent from all communication. When the headmaster finally admitted to the gathered parents that the park rangers had not seen the bus, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Whispers became gasps, and calm faces turned pale. Mothers clutched each other's hands, and fathers demanded answers, their voices rising with fear and frustration. The suggestion that maybe the bus had just taken a wrong turn did little to soothe anyone. After all, how could an entire school bus take a wrong turn and vanish without anyone noticing? By the afternoon, panic had taken hold like a spreading fire. Parents crowded outside Evergreen Elementary, their eyes darting constantly to the road, expecting at any moment to see the familiar yellow bus pull back into the lot. Some ran towards the nearby streets, as if they could somehow find the vehicle by sheer will. Others broke down into tears, unable to reconcile the cheerful morning send-off with the terrifying silence now pressing down on them. The police were brought in swiftly. Squad cars with flashing lights lined the town's main road as officers began questioning anyone who might have seen the bus. But witness after witness shook their heads. Nobody had seen the vehicle after it left the school gates. It was as if the moment the bus turned the corner, it disappeared from reality. Panic turned into disbelief, and disbelief into dread. By evening, the community had transformed into a restless search party. Farmers took out their tractors and combed the fields, searching for signs of a crash or tire tracks. Hunters with flashlights scoured the woods. Neighbors left their homes to knock on doors, asking if anyone had seen the children. Yet, no matter how far they looked, the truth was always the same. Nothing. The bus, and the 15 children inside it, had vanished into thin air. The police widened their net. Helicopters roared above, searchlights slicing through the darkness, while dogs were brought in to follow potential trails. But there were no scents, no tracks, no abandoned belongings. The children's last known location was still the school parking lot, a cruel fact that deepened the terror. The night was filled with the sound of sirens, helicopters, and the cries of mothers who could not accept that their children were gone. For the families, the waiting was unbearable. Some refused to leave the schoolyard, clinging to the hope that the bus would roll back in, headlights shining through the night. Others sat inside their homes with phones clutched in their hands, praying for a call that never came. Fear weighed on every conversation. Parents replayed the morning in their minds. Every smile, every goodbye, every promise to see you after the trip, wondering if they had missed some sign, some warning that could have stopped this nightmare. The police stations were flooded with calls. Some were false sightings. Someone claimed they saw a bus on the highway. Another insisted it was parked near an old barn. Each lead sent officers racing, but every time they returned empty-handed. Frustration boiled into anger. How could a vehicle so large, so noticeable, slip away without a single trace? Panic was no longer confined to families. It was gripping the entire town. As the night dragged on, theories began to swirl. Some whispered about an accident too terrible to speak of, one that authorities were hiding. Others suggested the unthinkable, that the children had been taken. Parents clung to their phones, desperate for any information, but the silence was louder than any words. The panic that had begun as unease had now transformed into pure fear. By dawn of the second day, Maplewood was unrecognizable. Streets that once echoed with the chatter of neighbors now resounded with the pounding footsteps of search parties. The yellow ribbons tied to fences and lampposts were meant to symbolize hope, but they fluttered in the wind like reminders of everything the town had lost. Panic was no longer a momentary reaction. It had become the very heartbeat of Maplewood, pulsing in every corner, growing louder with every passing hour that a town haunted. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood was no longer the cheerful town it once had been. The disappearance of the 15 children hung over every street, every household, and every conversation like a storm cloud that refused to clear. The laughter of children at play was replaced by silence, and schools became ghostly places where parents were afraid to send their remaining sons and daughters. The disappearance had not only stolen 15 lives, it had stolen the town's sense of safety. Shops that once rang with small-town chatter now echoed with hushed voices. Every customer brought up the same topic. Every transaction ended with the same question. Have they found the children yet? The answer was always no. With each day that passed, Maplewood grew quieter, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from the shadows. The empty school bus parking lot became a place of pilgrimage for parents and neighbors. Some left flowers, stuffed animals, or handwritten notes on the asphalt where the missing bus once stood. Others simply stood there, staring at the emptiness, unable to comprehend how something so big could vanish. It became a painful reminder that safety was no longer guaranteed, not even in the quietest corners of Maplewood. At night, the haunting was most vivid. Porch lights stayed on long after midnight, as families feared the darkness. Some parents claimed they could still hear faint echoes of children's laughter drifting through the air, while others swore they saw shadows darting along the tree line where the bus had once driven. Whether imagination or grief, the town seemed to breathe with sorrow and suspicion. Generations of children grew up hearing the story, whispered in warnings. Parents used it as a grim lesson. Stay close. Don't wander off. Remember what happened in 1986. For Maplewood's younger residents, the vanished field trip became more than history. It became a chilling bedtime tale that lived in their bones. It was not simply an event of the past, but an ever-present ghost shaping their childhood. Businesses suffered too. Tourism declined as news of the unsolved disappearance spread. Families from outside the town whispered that Maplewood was cursed, that something dark lingered there. Local motels that once welcomed travelers now sat half empty, their neon signs flickering in the night. The town that had once been defined by its community spirit was now defined by the mystery that refused to die. Some residents tried to leave Maplewood altogether. They packed their belongings and moved far away, hoping to escape the memories. But even they admitted later that the disappearance followed them. No matter where they went, the story lingered. It appeared in headlines, in books, and on television specials, dragging Maplewood's name with it. For those who stayed, there was no escape at all. The haunted atmosphere also fueled endless rumors. Some believed the bus had been swallowed by a sinkhole, hidden deep underground where no one could find it. Others whispered of government conspiracies, insisting that the truth was being kept from the public. The longer the mystery endured, the more twisted the theories became, each one feeding the fear and distrust that gripped the town. For the families of the missing children, the haunting was far more personal. Birthdays came and went with empty chairs at the table. Report cards stopped arriving, trophies stopped being won, and family portraits remained unfinished. Parents carried on with hollow routines, their lives marked by the absence of laughter that once filled their homes. Every knock at the door sent their hearts racing, but it was never their children. It was always another neighbor, another officer, another false lead. By the time the first anniversary arrived, Maplewood had changed forever. Vigils were held in silence, candles flickering in the night as names were read aloud. Some parents prayed for answers, others prayed simply for peace. But no matter how many candles were lit, the shadows seemed to grow darker, stretching across Maplewood and embedding themselves into its very identity. The town was no longer just Maplewood. It was the place where 15 children vanished, a community haunted by questions that had no end, the rumors and theories. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the absence of answers gave birth to whispers. The people of Maplewood could not live with silence, so they began filling it with theories. Each family, each neighbor, each passerby seemed to carry their own explanation of what had happened that morning in 1986. Some of these theories were whispered in hushed tones at night. Others shouted angrily in community meetings, but none brought comfort, only more fear. The most common theory, at first, was the simplest, an accident. Many believed the bus must have plunged into one of the many lakes or rivers surrounding the town. Perhaps the driver had lost control and the waters had swallowed them whole. Search divers combed through every body of water, but with nothing found, the theory felt more like a cruel dream than reality. Still, even years later, some locals swore that the bus was at the bottom of a lake, hidden by mud and weeds. Another theory turned suspicion toward the driver himself. Neighbors whispered about his quiet nature, his reclusive habits, and his lack of close friends. Could he have taken the children somewhere, led them into danger, or even orchestrated their disappearance? Investigators dug into his past, but no evidence linked him to anything sinister. Still, in the town's collective imagination, he became a shadowy figure, a man whose name was spoken less and less, as though saying it aloud might invite evil into the room. As the mystery stretched on, darker theories began to grow. Some claimed the children had been abducted by a cult, their bus diverted to some hidden place in the woods where rituals had taken place. Others whispered of secret tunnels, of a network beneath the town that had swallowed the bus whole. The ideas seemed absurd, yet in a place where logic had failed, even the strangest explanations felt possible. The more the police denied these theories, the more suspicion grew that something was being hidden. Some believed the government was involved, that federal agents had quietly taken over the investigation not to solve the mystery, but to bury it. The silence from officials only added fuel to these rumors. Why, townsfolk asked, had there been so few updates? Why did every lead vanish as quickly as the bus itself? Among the children at Evergreen Elementary, the rumors became part of playground legend. They told each other that the bus had driven into another world, a place where time stopped. Some said the children were still alive, trapped in a hidden place, waiting to come home. Others said the bus reappeared on foggy nights, headlights glowing in the distance, only to vanish again before anyone could follow. These stories spread fear, but also kept the memory of the missing children alive. There were those who insisted the bus had been seen. A farmer swore he spotted it driving along a dirt road days after the disappearance, though police dismissed his claim. A hunter claimed he saw a yellow blur deep in the woods, but when he followed it, he found nothing. Each account was inconsistent, each witness unreliable, yet every story kept the hope alive that perhaps the children were still out there, somewhere. Years later, as the case remained cold, new theories emerged with each generation. Amateur sleuths published articles speculating about hidden highways, cover-ups, and even paranormal forces. Television documentaries revisited the case, each one spinning the story into something even stranger, and Maplewood became known not just as a grieving town, but as a place of endless speculation. The rumors, while painful, also served as a strange form of survival. They gave the families something to cling to, some possibility, no matter how dark, that explained the inexplicable. To stop wondering would have meant accepting the worst, and most parents refused to let go of that sliver of hope. Rumors became their way of holding on, even as the years piled on with no answers. Yet, with every theory came more questions. If the bus was hidden, who had hidden it? If it had been taken, where had it gone? If the children were alive, why had they never returned? Each rumor seemed to open a new door into darkness, leaving Maplewood trapped in a maze of speculation with no way out. The lost futures. For the families of the 15 missing children, the greatest pain was not just the silence of the unanswered mystery, but the haunting absence of futures that would never be lived. Every year that passed was marked not by milestones, but by what could have been. Birthdays without cakes, graduations without applause, weddings that never took place. Their lives were a constant reminder of what had been stolen in that single morning in 1986. Parents who once dreamed of watching their children grow into adults now clung only to fading photographs. The smiling faces in school portraits remained frozen in time, while their classmates aged and moved forward in life. Each picture was like a wound, sweet memories mixed with unbearable sorrow. As friends of the missing grew taller, stronger, and eventually started families of their own, the 15 children remained forever young, trapped in the innocence of childhood. Some families kept their children's bedrooms untouched, as though they might return at any moment. Dust gathered on posters, toys sat where they had last been played with, and tiny shoes remained neatly lined at the edge of beds that were never slept in again. To outsiders, these rooms looked like shrines, but to the parents, they were promises, silent vows that they would never give up hope. The siblings of the vanished carried their own invisible scars. They grew up under shadows, always compared to the brothers and sisters who had been lost. Some felt guilty for surviving, while others felt forgotten as their parents poured all their energy into searching. Even as adults, they admitted that their lives had been shaped not by their own choices, but by the hole left behind by the missing. Their futures, too, were altered by that haunting absence. Teachers who had known the children mourned the careers, talents, and passions that would never be realized. One boy had dreamed of becoming a pilot. Another wanted to be a doctor, while one girl told her teacher she planned to write books that would make people cry and laugh at the same time. These dreams were cut short, and those who had heard them carried the weight of what might have been, silently wondering how different the world might look if those voices were still alive to shape it. As the years passed, anniversaries became increasingly painful. Each year the community gathered, and each year the parents imagined their children's faces older, wiser, transformed by time. They wondered what kind of adults they would have become, whether they would have stayed in Maplewood or moved far away, whether they would have found love, whether they would have children of their own. The cruelest part of the mystery was that these futures were never denied by death alone, but by uncertainty. No one knew if the children had been stolen, hidden, or worse, and so imagining their futures was both a comfort and a torment. The town itself carried the loss like a scar. Maplewood could not celebrate fully because every parade, every festival, every graduation reminded people of who was missing. When the high school class of 1993 graduated, there were 15 empty chairs in the auditorium, placed there by grieving families as a reminder that their sons and daughters should have been walking across that stage. Applause felt hollow, and even joy carried the weight of grief. The missing futures became a generational curse. By the 2000s, some of the parents had passed away, never knowing what had happened to their children. Their gravestones bore their names, but the absence of closure was carved deeper than stone. It was written into the lives of those who survived. For the children's siblings and cousins, the weight of carrying their stories became both a duty and a burden, as they felt responsible for keeping the memory alive. Journalists who revisited the case often noted how eerily timeless it felt. The photographs of the missing children, once printed in newspapers and stapled to telephone poles, remained unchanged while the world aged around them. People who once remembered their laughter now heard only silence. The world moved on, but Maplewood was stuck in 1986, haunted not only by what had been lost, but by the haunting thought of what should have been. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of the lost futures was that they were not buried in certainty, but suspended in mystery. If the children had been found, even in tragedy, their parents could have grieved fully. But instead, they were left to imagine their children's lives in fragments. Marriages that never happened, careers never pursued, families never started. The missing futures lived only in dreams, and those dreams never stopped haunting Maplewood. The shocking discovery. It was a quiet morning nearly 4 decades later when Maplewood was jolted awake once again. In 2025, a construction crew began work on a new housing project on the outskirts of town. The land was ordinary, covered with thick roots and soil, with nothing to suggest that it held secrets. Bulldozers and diggers moved earth in steady rhythm, until one of the machines struck something hard, something that did not belong beneath the ground. At first, workers thought they had hit a large pipe or an old septic tank. But as more soil was removed, a curved metal frame slowly began to emerge. The dull yellow paint, though faded and corroded, was unmistakable. It was a school bus, buried deep beneath the earth, hidden for decades. The bus had resurfaced like a ghost pulled from the ground. The moment the crew realized what they had found, work stopped immediately, and the police were called. Word spread through Maplewood like wildfire. Within hours, crowds gathered at the construction site, held back by yellow tape and officers who could barely contain the wave of curiosity and fear. For many, it was as if the missing past had clawed its way back to the surface. Parents who had aged into grandparents returned to the scene, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. Was this finally the answer they had waited 39 long years for? When investigators approached the bus, the air was heavy with silence. The vehicle was rusted, its windows shattered, its wheels partially disintegrated. The school logo was faint but still legible, and there was no doubt it was the same evergreen elementary bus that had disappeared in 1986. The earth had preserved it in darkness, hiding its existence until that very moment. But the question remained, what would be found inside? Carefully, the authorities pried open the bent and corroded door. Flashlights pierced the gloom, cutting through decades of dust. The first thing they noticed were the seats, still intact, though rotting and mold-covered. And then came the haunting sight: school bags, notebooks, sneakers, and even a stuffed bear lying in the aisle, as though waiting for their owners to return. Each object told a story, a frozen fragment of that day, preserved in eerie silence. What they did not find was even more disturbing. There were no remains, no bodies, no bones, no trace of the 15 children or the driver. It was as if they had stepped off the bus before it was buried, leaving only their belongings behind. The discovery that should have brought closure instead unraveled a deeper, darker layer of mystery. How could the bus be here, but not the children? Who had put it underground? And why? The scene became a circus of media attention. News vans crowded the streets, and cameras flashed as the story made headlines across the nation once more. Interviews with weeping parents filled television screens, their voices trembling as they relived the pain they had tried to bury for decades. The discovery did not bring relief. It tore open old wounds and left the entire country asking the same haunting questions. For investigators, the buried bus was not only shocking, it was baffling. How had no one noticed a vehicle of that size being hidden underground? Why had no construction or development in the last 39 years stumbled upon it? Experts examined the soil and concluded the burial had been deliberate. Someone had wanted the bus hidden. That revelation sent chills through Maplewood. If someone had buried the bus, what else had they done to keep the truth hidden? The townspeople flocked to the construction site for weeks, leaving flowers, photographs, and letters at the edge of the yellow tape. For them, the sight of the bus was both a nightmare and a shrine. Children who had grown up hearing the story of the vanished field trip now saw the rusted shell with their own eyes. It was no longer just a legend. It was real, and it was far more chilling than the stories had ever suggested. Even as the bus was carefully lifted from the earth and transported for forensic analysis, Maplewood was left trembling. The shocking discovery did not solve the mystery, it deepened it. The bus had returned, but the children had not. And with its reappearance came the chilling realization that someone, somewhere, had gone to great lengths to ensure that the truth would remain hidden for nearly 40 years, the haunting evidence. When investigators stepped inside the buried bus, what struck them most was not just its decay, but the fragments of life left behind. Scattered across the mold-covered seats and rusted floor were objects that seemed frozen in time. Children's belongings that had survived nearly 4 decades underground. Each one carried a weight far heavier than its size, each one whispering the presence of the children who had vanished. The first item recovered was a small, faded backpack. Inside, there were notebooks filled with neat handwriting, math problems half solved, and doodles scrawled in the margins. The paper had yellowed, but the words were still visible. Investigators later handed the notebook to the child's family, who recognized the handwriting instantly. The pages, once part of an ordinary school day, now felt like a message from the grave. Near the driver's seat, a pair of sneakers lay side by side, laces still tied. They were too small for an adult, clearly belonging to one of the missing children. One of the soles had a heart drawn in pen, as if the child had marked it with love before wearing it. Seeing them there, untouched and abandoned, was more chilling than if they had been scattered in chaos. It suggested someone had placed them carefully, or that they had been left behind in a hurry that no one could explain. Perhaps the most haunting find was a stuffed teddy bear resting on one of the back seats. Its fur was matted with dirt, one button eye missing, but its smile remained. Investigators paused when they picked it up, struck by the innocence it represented. A toy meant to comfort had instead become a silent witness to a tragedy no one understood. When it was shown on national television, many viewers wept openly because every parent knew what it meant for a child to leave behind their favorite toy. Dozens of lunchboxes were also found, some still containing the rusted remains of food wrappers, juice cartons, and thermos bottles. Each lunch had been carefully packed by a parent that morning in 1986, never knowing it would never be eaten. To see them still sealed, still waiting, was a cruel reminder of lives interrupted in the middle of their simplest routines. Parents who saw photographs of the items said they remembered packing those exact meals, the memory now sharper and more painful than ever. The seats of the bus bore scratches and carvings, hearts, initials, small drawings etched by restless hands. Investigators realized these marks had been made by the missing children in the days before their disappearance, when they rode the bus daily to school. The etchings had outlived their makers, leaving behind ghostly fingerprints of lives that never grew older. To touch the seats was to touch the innocence of children who had vanished into legend. Even more unsettling were the loose papers found scattered on the floor. One note, written in pencil, read simply, "Can't wait for the trip." The handwriting was light, hurried, as though scribbled in excitement. Another slip of paper carried a child's attempt at a joke. These fragments were ordinary in every way, and yet, because of what followed, they became eerie, reminders that the children had been joyful, unaware of what fate awaited them. The condition of the bus itself raised disturbing questions. The doors and windows appeared forced shut before the burial, as though someone had sealed the vehicle. Yet there was no blood, no signs of struggle, no remains. The belongings seemed carefully left behind, untouched by violence, but abandoned in a way that defied explanation. It was as if the children had vanished into thin air, leaving only the objects that once defined their daily lives. When the evidence was displayed publicly, it tore through Maplewood like a storm. Families collapsed in tears at the sight of shoes, toys, and notebooks they recognized instantly. Neighbors stood in stunned silence, grappling with the reality that these relics had been beneath their very feet for 39 years. The objects were more than evidence. They were echoes, haunting fragments of a tragedy that refused to be buried. Even today, those items remain locked in evidence storage, studied by forensic experts and guarded as sacred. But for the families, they're not just objects. They are reminders of voices that went silent, of footsteps that never returned home, of futures stolen. The haunting evidence left inside the buried bus did not answer the question of what happened. It only deepened the shadows surrounding the mystery, the dark questions. The discovery of the bus should have brought closure, but instead, it opened a door to darker questions, questions that cut deeper with every answer withheld. The first and most obvious one haunted everyone in Maplewood. If the bus had been found, where were the children? 15 lives had vanished without a trace, and the bus alone could not explain their fate. Investigators wondered whether the children had been taken off the bus before it was buried. But by whom? And why? If it had been the work of one person, how could they have overpowered so many children and a driver? If it had been the work of many, why had no one seen or heard anything on that ordinary morning in 1986? Each possibility seemed more impossible than the last. The second chilling question was about the burial itself. How had a school bus, massive, heavy, and impossible to hide without machinery, ended up beneath the earth without anyone noticing? Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal it. But what kind of person would have access to the equipment, the land, and the secrecy required to bury a vehicle of that size? And what did they gain from hiding it? There were also questions about timing. Had the bus been buried immediately after the children vanished? Or had it been hidden years later, long after the search had quieted? Forensic experts tried to read the layers of soil, but the results were murky. The uncertainty only deepened the horror. If it had been hidden later, it meant someone had kept the bus, waiting for the right time to make it disappear permanently. The belongings left behind inside the bus posed their own puzzles. Why were the children's shoes, backpacks, and toys still there, but not the children themselves? Were they forced to leave everything behind? Or had the items been staged, deliberately left to confuse investigators decades later? Each object felt less like evidence and more like a riddle designed to taunt those searching for the truth. Even the lack of violence inside the bus created unease. There were no signs of struggle, no broken seats, no blood. It was almost too clean, too silent, as though the children had simply stepped out willingly or been let out by someone they trusted. That possibility was more frightening than any act of force, because it meant the danger had come from a familiar face. Some began to wonder if the driver himself had been part of something larger. Had he betrayed the children? Or had he been a victim too, forced into a situation he could not escape? His absence from the bus raised just as many questions as the missing children. Without him, there was no witness, no testimony, no explanation of what had happened on that road. The police faced a terrifying realization. If someone had been capable of pulling off such a disappearance and cover-up, then it had likely required planning, resources, and secrecy on a scale no one had considered before. Was Maplewood harboring a hidden truth, one buried deeper than the bus itself? The thought gnawed at investigators and citizens alike. For the families, the questions were more personal and more painful. They asked themselves what their children had felt in those final moments. Fear, confusion, trust. They wondered if their children had looked for them, cried for them, or held on to one another. Every question was a wound that never healed, a reminder that the answers lay just out of reach. And perhaps the darkest question of all remained unspoken but ever present. Was the bus truly the end of the trail, or just another carefully placed piece in a puzzle designed to never be solved? If the children were not inside, if they had never been found, then where were they? And who, after all these years, still knew the truth? The emotional toll. The emotional toll of the 1986 disappearance had never left Maplewood, but the discovery of the buried bus reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar. For nearly 4 decades, families had lived in an uneasy balance between hope and despair. Now, standing before the relic of their children's last known moments, that balance collapsed, and grief poured out like a flood that could no longer be contained. Parents who had grown old clinging to fading photographs of their children broke down at the sight of the backpacks, shoes, and lunchboxes. Some had lived there, entire adult lives waiting for a knock on the door, hoping it would be their child finally coming home. To them, the bus was both a confirmation and a betrayal, proof that the children had indeed been there, but silence on what had become of them afterward. The siblings of the missing carried their own burdens. Many had grown up in the shadows of absence, their childhoods defined not by play, but by whispers of mystery and long nights watching their parents grieve. Some admitted that they never felt truly seen by their families, as though they were living replacements for the brother or sister who had vanished. Seeing the bus unearthed forced them to relive a pain they had inherited rather than chosen. The community of Maplewood, too, bore scars. Every teacher, every neighbor, every shopkeeper remembered the morning the children never returned. The discovery reignited the guilt of those who had once dismissed the parents' cries for help, or who had believed rumors that the children might have run away. Now, as the evidence surfaced, shame mixed with grief, leaving the town in a state of uneasy silence. For some, the return of the bus brought nightmares. They imagined the children's laughter turning to cries, the last minutes inside that vehicle replaying endlessly in their minds. Parents woke in the night hearing phantom footsteps on their stairs, convinced for a moment that their child had finally come home, only to remember the reality waiting outside their door. The discovery had not closed the case. It had carved the wound deeper. The emotional toll stretched across generations. Younger residents of Maplewood, who had not even been born in 1986, found themselves caught in the web of the tragedy. They grew up hearing fragments of the story, warnings, cautionary tales, and whispers about the buried bus. For them, the discovery wasn't just history. It was proof that the darkness their parents spoke of had been real all along. Faith, too, was shaken. Some parents had prayed for decades, begging for answers, believing that God would eventually reveal the truth. The bus's discovery challenged that faith, making them wonder why such a cruel mystery had been allowed to endure for so long. Churches held vigils, but even prayers felt hollow in the face of evidence that gave no clarity. Marriages had been broken by the weight of a loss. Some couples could not withstand the endless searching, the sleepless nights, the blame that inevitably fell between husband and wife. Others stayed together, but in silence, their bond cemented not by love, but by shared suffering. For them, the bus was not just a crime scene. It was the coffin of the life they might have had. The national attention the case drew after the bus's discovery added to the torment. Cameras captured the tears of grieving parents. Headlines dissected every item found, and strangers from around the country speculated wildly about the children's fate. Families felt exposed, their deepest pain turned into spectacle, and yet they had no choice but to endure it. Above all, the emotional toll was measured in emptiness. The empty chairs at family dinners, the birthdays that passed uncelebrated, the graduations, weddings, and milestones that never came. The bus was not just a piece of evidence. It was a mirror reflecting everything that had been stolen. And as Maplewood mourned once more, the question grew heavier. How could life move forward when the past refused to let go? The lingering mystery. Even after the bus was unearthed, the mystery of the 15 missing children refused to resolve itself. If anything, the discovery only deepened the shadows that had always surrounded the case. The school bus was there, silent and rusted, but the children were not. Their absence lingered in every corner of the story, a void that no amount of searching could fill. The bus answered nothing. It merely asked the same question louder. What happened to them? The haunting detail was that no human remains were ever recovered from the site. Soil samples were tested, every inch of the bus was examined, and yet there was nothing, no trace of DNA, no evidence of a struggle. It was as though the children had been erased from existence, leaving behind only their belongings as proof they had ever been there at all. That absence felt almost deliberate, like the work of someone who wanted the mystery to endure. Investigators struggled to move forward because every lead twisted back into itself. Theories abounded. Mass abduction, ritual sacrifice, government cover-up, or something even stranger. Each theory had its believers, but none had the weight of proof. It was as if the truth existed just beyond reach, mocking those who try to grasp it. The uncertainty was suffocating, leaving even hardened detectives unable to sleep at night. The townspeople of Maplewood lived in constant unease, never able to close the chapter. They drove past the wooded area where the bus had been buried, imagining the children's voices echoing in the trees. Parents who had once told their kids the world was safe no longer believed their own words. The town became defined by its unanswered question, its identity forever tied to the mystery that refused to die. Journalists, drawn by the case's eerie endurance, called it the riddle of the buried bus. Books were written, documentaries filmed, podcasts launched, each trying to solve the unsolvable. But with every new retelling, more contradictions surfaced, more shadows stretched across the timeline. Instead of bringing clarity, the attention only made the mystery grow larger, feeding it until it felt unstoppable. The buried bus itself became an artifact of fear. Kept in storage for study, it was said to radiate unease. Officers who worked the case reported feeling watched whenever they examined it. Some refused to go near it at all. The families described it as a coffin without bodies, a tomb that mocked them with silence. To look at it was to look at the face of a mystery that would never speak. Generations passed, but the mystery lingered in whispers. Children growing up in Maplewood were told not to play too far from home, not to wander into the woods, and above all, not to ask too many questions about 1986. Yet the buried bus was always there, a ghostly reminder that safety could vanish in an instant. The case was less a story than a shadow, passed down from parent to child. Even the survivors of Maplewood, the aging parents, the siblings, the neighbors, could not escape the lingering weight. Every birthday that should have been celebrated, every milestone that never came, was a reminder of what was missing. They lived with the unbearable tension of knowing the truth was out there, hidden, waiting, yet never revealed. Hope and despair clashed endlessly inside them, leaving them trapped in a cycle that had no end. The more time passed, the stranger the mystery felt. How could 15 children and a bus driver vanish without leaving a single trace? How could a bus be buried without anyone noticing? Why had no confession ever surfaced? No slip of the tongue, no evidence uncovered in nearly 40 years. The silence was deafening, and with each year that passed, the truth seemed both closer and farther away. And so, the mystery lingered, not as a closed chapter, but as a living wound. The unearthed bus was not a discovery, but a reminder. The past could not be buried, not truly. Something had happened in 1986, something so dark and deliberate that it had left a mark on everyone who dared to remember. And until the missing were found, the question, the lingering mystery. Even after the bus was unearthed, the mystery of the 15 missing children refused to resolve itself. If anything, the discovery only deepened the shadows that had always surrounded the case. The school bus was there, silent and rusted, but the children were not. Their absence lingered in every corner of the story, a void that no amount of searching could fill. The bus answered nothing. It merely asked the same question louder. What happened to them? The haunting detail was that no human remains were ever recovered from the site. Soil samples were tested, Every inch of the bus was examined, and yet there was nothing, no trace of DNA, no evidence of a struggle. It was as though the children had been erased from existence, leaving behind only their belongings as proof they had ever been there at all. That absence felt almost deliberate, like the work of someone who wanted the mystery to endure. Investigators struggled to move forward because every lead twisted back into itself. Theories abounded. Mass abduction, ritual sacrifice, government cover-up, or something even stranger. Each theory had its believers, but none had the weight of proof. It was as if the truth existed just beyond reach, mocking those who try to grasp it. The uncertainty was suffocating, leaving even hardened detectives unable to sleep at night. The townspeople of Maplewood lived in constant unease, never able to close the chapter. They drove past the wooded area where the bus had been buried, imagining the children's voices echoing in the trees. Parents who had once told their kids the world was safe no longer believed their own words. The town became defined by its unanswered question, its identity forever tied to the mystery that refused to die. Journalists, drawn by the case's eerie endurance, called it the riddle of the buried bus. Books were written, documentaries filmed, podcasts launched, each trying to solve the unsolvable. But with every new retelling, more contradictions surfaced, more shadows stretched across the timeline. Instead of bringing clarity, the attention only made the mystery grow larger, feeding it until it felt unstoppable. The buried bus itself became an artifact of fear. Kept in storage for study, it was said to radiate unease. Officers who worked the case reported feeling watched whenever they examined it. Some refused to go near it at all. The families described it as a coffin without bodies, a tomb that mocked them with silence. To look at it was to look at the face of a mystery that would never speak. Generations passed, but the mystery lingered in whispers. Children growing up in Maplewood were told not to play too far from home, not to wander into the woods, and above all, not to ask too many questions about 1986. Yet the buried bus was always there, a ghostly reminder that safety could vanish in an instant. The case was less a story than a shadow, passed down from parent to child. Even the survivors of Maplewood, the aging parents, the siblings, the neighbors, could not escape the lingering weight. Every birthday that should have been celebrated, every milestone that never came, was a reminder of what was missing. They lived with the unbearable tension of knowing the truth was out there, hidden, waiting, yet never revealed. Hope and despair clashed endlessly inside them, leaving them trapped in a cycle that had no end. The more time passed, the stranger the mystery felt. How could 15 children and a bus driver vanish without leaving a single trace? How could a bus be buried without anyone noticing? Why had no confession ever surfaced, no slip of the tongue, no evidence uncovered in nearly 40 years? The silence was deafening, and with each year that passed, the truth seemed both closer and farther away. And so, the mystery lingered, not as a closed chapter, but as a living wound. The unearthed bus was not a discovery, but a reminder. The past could not be buried, not truly. Something had happened in 1986, something so dark and deliberate that it had left a mark on everyone who dared to remember. And until the missing were found, the question would remain, heavy and unending, hanging over Maplewood like a storm that never passed.